Hey you guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be going over the era of good feelings, a little bit over the Monroe Doctrine, and also explaining some of the most important parts of the market revolution or the American system. I do have a video that I need you guys to watch right underneath this one. It's a crash course on the market revolution and the era of good feelings, and it really gives you a pretty good overview, understanding of what's going on during this time period as well. So make sure that you watch that. But in this video, I'm going to be going over, the specific details that are going to be on the test. Okay. So our objectives today are going to describe what the economic system was, known as the American system. How did it work? Who were its big cheerleaders, people that promoted it, people that wanted the government to invest in these internal improvements. We'll talk about all of that. And then also the three specific parts of the market revolution that took place during the early 19th century in the United States, okay? And so we'll talk about how the U.S. developed industrially, economically, as well as the cities, all of that during this time. Okay, so market revolution, very simple. Basically, it is an economic and social changes that led to the integrated national marketplace. So what we're talking about here is a complete coordination of production, distribution, consumption of goods. The United States, as previously described in this class, is changing. It is totally transforming. Industrialization is going up, in part because of Jefferson's policies, right? Remember the embargo, right? We couldn't trade, we couldn't get things from England. So what did Americans do? They started producing things for themselves. So what's happening now is this right here. We're moving away from producing things for themselves. Remember, people used to live on farms. They used to be completely self-sufficient. They had their animals there that they could get milk from. They could get wool from the sheep. They made things by themselves. There was no reason for them to go into the store and buy these things. They made it for themselves. But that's changing, okay? So now people are making more than just for themselves. They are, it's like a surplus. And they're selling to others. There's trade. There's bartering. People are working in factories because factories are starting to spring up, okay? And so one of the major lessons that we learned after the War of 1812 was, we weren't ready. We weren't ready for that. For some reason, we didn't get completely obliterated by the British. And so, one of the things that we learned there was that, hey, we might have not lost, which was a win for the United States, because we went toe-to-toe with Britain again, and we didn't lose, which was a win. But if we were going to be a first-rate, nation, we really needed to step up our infrastructure, our our economy, our banking system, roads. I mean, we didn't have those things, right? Which is part of what made fighting the British in 1812 so difficult. We didn't have a military. We didn't have any of those things. And so we're going to take those lessons and make them right? The U.S. has so much potential here. And so the idea behind this economic plan is to take the United States to the next level, okay? So the idea here is that the federal government, okay, that the government should be spending money, should be encouraging this economic development by specifically creating roads and canals called internal improvements. So whenever you hear that word right there, internal improvements, what are they talking about? They're talking about roads and canals, transportation. Who should pay for it? The government, okay? So the other thing as well is developing economic situations that would benefit businesses, that would benefit the American people, that would benefit the American economy. And so, again, we're talking about government spending, government money. The other thing as well, the third part of this economic plan, is to secure American economic interests, right? So, in other words, protect American economies, protect American businesses. How? By by putting in tariffs, by taxing imports, right? Making those goods more expensive so that people buy American made, and so that American businesses can thrive and the American economy can do better than ever. And all of this, this economic plan is based on the idea that the government should make this happen. Now, the ironic thing about this is that we're still talking about the Democratic Republicans, right? We're still talking about the same party. But these are not the same Democratic Republicans from Jefferson's, era. They are still the same party, but remember that they used to talk about how, they want small government, small spending. We're moving away from that, okay, during this time period. So, as a precursor to making all of these changes happen and benefit the American people on the whole, American businesses, and for this plan to work, we have to have a national bank. So this is where they're going to go ahead and establish the second bank of the United States. And part of those tariffs, right, that protective tariff is going to be 25% tax on imports. So, it works really well if you're an American business and you're selling American goods because anything coming in from overseas is going to be, much more expensive. So again, it goes to the idea that this is to benefit the American people, American businesses, and so far, it's going to work, okay? Now, the other thing that I want to mention before you move on to the crash course video has to do with the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is obviously, something that happens under President James Monroe. So again, if we do like a little recap of our presidents, right? Remember, we had Washington and Adams. They were Federalists. And then you had Jefferson, Democratic Republican. This is where that transition of power happens. Jefferson, Madison, and now you have Monroe. 3 Democratic Republicans. Remember, this is the era of good feelings. This is where basically there's no political competition. It's basically one party that dominates politics in America. So anyways, under President James Monroe, he makes his declaration in 1823 that basically says that the United States is going to stay out of European affairs, okay? In part because these European countries, it's been war after war after war, and the U.S. does not want to get involved with that. So in other words, what we're talking about here is isolationism, okay? The United States is not going to be getting involved in foreign affairs, and instead, it's going to focus on itself. It's going to focus inward, developing that infrastructure, developing that American economy, and, really stick to itself. So stay out of foreign affairs, focus on what's going on here in the country, and grow the country, expand, make the cities grow, developing our infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads, all of these changes, that transformational period, it takes place in part thanks to the Monroe Doctrine and our isolationist stance. Now, in addition to the Monroe Doctrine, it also proclaimed that any European nation trying to colonize Latin America would be treated as a hostile party. And so what that means is that, we're kind of reasserting ourselves, that the Western Hemisphere is the domain of the United States, that this is our, realm of influence, okay? This is our sphere of influence. European countries stay over there. The U.S., is going to reign completely on this side of the world. And so the idea here is not only to keep European powers out of North and South America, keep them from interfering, but then also establishing ourselves as, the most powerful nation on this side of the world, okay? So the Monroe Doctrine is going to be our foreign policy until 1917. So that's when the United States joins World War I, okay? Isolation, it's going to be very hard to break away from that, nearly 100 years of isolationism, but that's the way that it works. So it's about keeping European powers out, reestablishing the fact that this is our domain, this is our sphere of influence, and not only that, but focusing on ourselves, right? Not getting entangled in foreign affairs, but focusing on our national interest here at home, okay? So, let me see. Of course, there are going to be opponents to the American system. Obviously, there's Southerners that don't like it because, the American system is an attempt to take away taxes away from them. And so, they just don't like that at all. But in addition to that, part of the problem here with the South is that they're upset that this tariff, that is supposed to help American businesses, actually makes things more expensive for people in the South. Because as you can imagine, Southerners are going to focus on what? Agriculture. They're going to focus on cotton. They're going to focus on tobacco, indigo, rice. And they're not really going to develop their economy in any other way. It's mostly just agriculture. So what about clothing? What about furniture? What about, everyday household items? Well, they have to import them. They have to get them from somewhere else. And so if the United States is going to move forward with this tariff that makes imports more expensive in order for American companies to thrive and do well, that might benefit the companies up in the north. But what about Southerners in the South that actually have to rely on imports? Well, it makes things more expensive for them. So they're opposed to this American system on multiple, levels. The other problem that Southerners have with the American system is, okay, where is all this money going to come from for these internal improvements, right? The roads, the canals, turnpikes, railroads, all of that. Well, the money's going to come from the import taxes, right? Those tariffs, that 25% tariff. But where are these improvements taking place? They're not happening in the South. They're happening in the North. And so Southerners are going like, wait a minute. So we're paying for these taxes, and you're taking the money and improving the North. How is that fair? It's not. And so, from the beginning, there's a lot of people opposed to it. So, just some things there to consider. When it comes to the different parts of the market revolution, it's three. Okay, you got transportation and communications revolution. You got transportation of commercialized farming. Transition to commercialized farming. So, of course, tractors and, new technologies that are going to increase the amount that farmers are producing. And also industrialization, okay? One of the biggest changes here, of course, is that more people are going to work in factories, okay? Why? Well, there's more jobs available. Immigration is also taking place during this time, so where are people going to go? Are they going to go buy land? Not if they don't have the money. Or are they going to get a factory job? And so the transition here is that you have more people working in factories, meaning they are wage earners. And if you remember when we're talking about Jefferson, right, he was suspicious of the cities. He didn't like them. He didn't like strong central governments. He believed that this should be, his vision for the United States was that it should be an agrarian nation, one that, produced perfect kinds of citizens, right? There's a certain virtue there. And so this new United States, this transition, in part because of the market revolution, is exactly what Jefferson didn't want to happen. And we talked about this, right? His idea of freedom was that a man, had his own little piece of land and was totally independent, didn't have to rely on anybody. The perfect kind of government was the one that didn't infringe on his rights, on his property. And the opposite is happening here, because as people become wage earners instead of working for themselves, they're losing their freedom, right? They're essentially being slaves by working with somebody else. The other change, of course, that is happening during this time is women are entering the workforce. And so even though they're entering the workforce, they're getting paid significantly lower than their male counterparts. And the reason for this is pretty much a legal reason. So women, legally, were supposed to be supplementing, the man's income. They were never supposed to be the head of household or the main breadwinner. And because of that, that justified legally their wages being reduced, drastically compared to what men were getting paid. So again, women are entering the workforce. Lots of immigrants are entering the workforce. All of this challenges Jefferson's idea of freedom, as we are transitioning into this new the market revolution, right? Where people are no longer producing things for themselves. They are producing more than ever before, and they are selling. People are becoming consumers, customers, not just landowners, out in the West. The other thing I want to go over very, very quickly before you move on to the other video are the eras of the transportation revolution. So transportation revolution specifically deals with turnpikes, canals, steamboats, and railroads. Now, by the time we get to 1860, which is, on the eve of the election of Abraham Lincoln, there's only about 30,000 miles of railroad built. But that's going to drastically increase as, the years go on. So when we're talking about the transportation revolution, just remember, this is what we're talking about here. Turnpikes, canals, steamboats, and railroads. And for more information on this, you're going to watch the video coming up on the market revolution. Another change as well in the communications revolution is how communication was no longer dependent on just physically being there, person to person, or the travel of an envelope, right, containing a letter to a physical location miles away, or to another distance. With Samuel Morse's transmission of the first telegraph, this is going to change everything, because now people can communicate, within a matter of minutes. It's going to facilitate commerce. So now you can trade across the country, from state to state, at all times, at all hours of the day. It actually lowered the cost of communication as well. And the thing that's interesting too is that a lot of these telegraph companies are going to use the railroads as the line of communication as well. So wherever you see the railroads, that's usually where the telegraph companies, or where you could go and get that message. So again, this is a complete revolution, because you're no longer dependent on actually having to physically be there to communicate with somebody. It could be done through these series of little messages, and you could trade, you can invest, you can send out, reports on what's happening, in New York to Georgia, or, across the other side of the country. And so again, big change here as well. When it comes to commercialized farming in the South, the invention of the cotton gin is going to essentially guarantee that slavery is going to stick around. It's going to make cotton growing extremely profitable. You no longer need to have really rich, fertile land to grow a crop to make good money off of it. With the cotton gin, what it did was it sped up the process of cleaning it, which previously had been very labor intensive. It just wasn't worth it economically. But the cotton gin facilitated that, and once it went into place, all you had to do was get a little piece of land, and that's it. Get some slaves, and you basically could make a lot of money. So this idea that slavery was going to phase out at some point, that it was just going to die out as this peculiar institution, is going to fade away pretty fast. Okay, so that idea is just going to go out the window. In the West, one of the changes that you see here as well is that farmers are going to be taking advantage of the Land Act of 1820. So what this law basically did was it promoted settlement of the West by selling out smaller parcels of land, and maybe putting them into payments as well, making land ownership easier and cheaper, right? So you didn't have to buy, 100, 200, 300, 400 acres of land. You could buy 10, 20, 30 acres of land. So that's cheaper. But then also, you can pay it over time. And so what's the big, so what is this important, why should I know this? Because the Land Act of 1820 is essentially going to guarantee that now that the U.S. has doubled in size, guess what's going to happen? Continued expansion. We're going to continue to move out there as well. So all of these changes are happening, but because of continued expansion, the issue of slavery is going to come up again. Okay, so when it comes to Missouri is ready to be a state, but the problem is that, there's a lot of people that don't want slavery around, not just because they're opposed to it, morally or ethically, but because they think it would be an unfair competition. I'm a small farmer and I only have a small piece of land. But if somebody comes in and they buy 100, 200 acres and they have 100, 200 slaves, how is that going to be fair to me? So I don't want it there. And so there's all kinds of different anti-slavery arguments out there. The Talmadge Amendment, when it comes to Missouri, it would have enforced gradual emancipation in Missouri. But of course, that one doesn't happen. There's a lot of debate, a lot of fierce, passionate debate over whether or not Missouri, now that it's ready to be a state, should be a slave state or not. Henry Clay, who is going to be known as, the great compromiser, is going to come in and finally gets both pro-slavery and anti-slavery defendants to agree to the 3630 line. So what this does is it basically says that the southern border of Missouri, and let me see if I have a map here. I don't see it. But that the southern border of Missouri that's the 3630 line, right? So latitude and longitude. That anything below that 3630 line, so anything below the southern border of Mississippi, future states to come, anything below that line would be a slave state. And anything above would be a free state, right? So we're talking about Missouri, the southern border at the bottom. Anything coming in, any future state coming in below that will be a slave state, like Texas, for example, Oklahoma, and anything above it would be free. Okay, so this allows Missouri to come in as a slave state, and Maine, which is ready to become a state as well, but had been previously blocked by slavery supporters because they wanted to come in as a free state. That's the compromise. So 3630 line, anything south of it, future states to come, are going to be slave state. Anything above it, free state. And Missouri comes in as a slave state, and Maine comes in as a free state. Okay, if you remember, Maine was carved out of Massachusetts. So you got that there. Anyways, the market revolution is going to lead to a decline in general for farmers in New England. And so, when we're looking ahead here, moving out west was the key to freedom. Okay, 6 new states are going to be created during this time. Manifest destiny, which is something that we're going to talk about extensively, is this idea that God created the United States for a reason, for a purpose, that Americans' destiny was to encompass the U.S. from sea to shining sea, and so God willed it to be that way, and you better not get in our way, and this is powerful juju. It's powerful stuff that is going to justify continued expansion. It's going to justify moving Native Americans off of that land. And so in addition to that, you have lots of immigrants that are coming to the United States during this time, especially the Irish, due to a potato famine, a potato blight is resulting in starvation, massive starvation. So all of these changes are happening in the United States during this time. There's going to be a series of booms and busts. Andrew Jackson is going to be the topic of our next lecture, and so we'll talk about how he was personally affected by that as well. But as the increase of workers continues, we're going to be talking about worker rights, worker protections, the abuses, exploitations, especially of immigrants that don't know any better, that don't feel protected, that they're being exploited. We're going to talk about the unions and stuff like that. So on the whole, the United States, as it's growing, it's developing. The cities are popping up. More people are moving to the United States. It is becoming more prosperous, but it also kind of creates this conflicting image because now people are feeling that because of the market revolution, the city has grown, the country has developed exponentially, things are improving, but they're also left with much less freedom than they had, 50 years before. So there is a bit of a crisis there that you can see in American literature that's written during this time, like Walden and, guys like, he wrote Leaves of Grass and Ralph Waldo Emerson and stuff like that. So lots of interesting stuff here. Can't go over it all, but do make sure to watch the next video, the crash course on the market revolution, and I will catch you on the next video after that, the one dealing with Andrew Jackson. Okay? So have yourselves a good one. Make sure to email me if you have any questions on anything, and see you later.